you mentioned earlier about the Dia thing, and that was another thing. And this is before we were talking about these plays. We were talking about writing, and that's another key element when you're writing is there's so much. I mean, in any given day, there's so much that you can pick up and use. And it's always amazed me with writers, even the best writers, is they have this cliche of, oh, I've got to think of something to write about. I've got to sit down and I've got to, I'm going to write a poem or whatnot. What am I going to write? I have to think of, no, what did you do just in the last 24 hours? This play has Danny driving to work and this deer running into the side of his car. And because Danny is going slower in the fog, he doesn't run over the deer. The deer, though, runs into the side of his car. And that's a good metaphor because Danny is ensconced in the car. It's foggy. And this outside force of nature wants to get in somehow and accidentally rams into it. And yet he keeps on driving. And then he goes later and to see if the thing is dead or whatnot. And it's not. And he feels better about it. But there are so many ways that you can take these things. And, there's so much poesy. And if you look at all of the plays that I've written, from the first ones up until these last ones, I mean, you can tell that I'm a poet because I do things that only a poet, a great poet, would do. But most great poets can't write prose. Most great poets can't write a play, much less a great play. And most poets don't even think that they could do that. And playwrights certainly don't have that ability. I mean, Tennessee Williams published some bad poems, so did O'Neill. But they're just sort of jizzing.
What
It's
do you
not
think
really
it is
poetry.
about some of these writers that are very poetic in their prose but can't write poetry, like Isley and Williams in drama?
Uh, well, Isley is probably someone who's the best of them. I mean, he was a good, solid poet. He's sort of a lesser version of Mark Van Doren that I told you about. Um, that's just the way it is. Most people, I mean,
His poems though read like prose. I just got a book of his.
Isley,
Yes, and they read like prose. He doesn't enjam anything. He doesn't.
yeah.
There's no real attempt at poetry, and you can sort of feel some of the his natural music that he has in prose, but it doesn't really serve any kind of purpose in the poem.
Yeah, and I read somewhere once where he admitted that his poetry wasn't a natural poet, and at
And he
least
was
he.
also one of these who wrote about the same thing, always nature. And he's accused of being a nature writer in his science essays, but those are actually very diverse. They cover a lot of his life, but his poetry is much more indicative of that, where he has a lot of nature poems and poems about birds and poems about some kind of scientific theory and his praise to Darwin. Those sort of meld together.
Yeah, and but uh, most writers, I mean, Jessica and I are probably the only writers I can think of that have been able to really uh, comfortably move back at a high level between the various disciplines. It's difficult. I mean, writing is much more difficult. Art, and I was talking about arguing with this kid on the e-list. Art is much more difficult than any other human discipline. Not just by a little bit, not just by 1 or 2%, but by multiples. There's no comparison. Mathematics, science, are utter child's play. I know that, for example, if I didn't have artistic talent and I focused on math or science, uh, I could do a lot in there, but I find it boring. And so why would I want to waste my time on something that doesn't challenge me? But art is the constant challenge because you are creating, in a sense, ex nihilo. All art is influenced by other art. Well, everything is influenced by certain things, but uh, a, a Norwegian in the family, while it has many influences, there's nothing like it. You remove Dan Schneider. If I didn't exist, no one in an infinity minus one universes to come would ever write a Norwegian in the family again. It just can't happen because it was specific to the time and the place and the person, me, that I was then and then experiencing and then writing it, that produced that book. And that's not the same with science. You know, if technology had proceeded much more quickly, say after the fall of Rome, 500 years earlier, there would have been an Edison inventing light bulbs. 600 years before Einstein, there would have been an Einstein, and it wouldn't have mattered whether Newton had come along. But there'd never be a Melville. Art is fundamentally the thing that is the most human. It's what separates us from all other creatures. Not that, I mean, there are some abstract things that some things like some whales and primates and elephants and a few other things can do, but not to the degree that human beings can do. And a play like this is a good example. It's an excellent example. Here, you know, how many times have you or anyone else that might watch this, you know, years from now, how many times have you thought, oh, you know, I've known 5 different people who were Polish, and they all were similar in certain ways. Well, I've known 5 different women who had red hair, and they were this way. I've known, or you know, people who have the same name, and how they play off of each other. How, you know, that's the thing that's interesting here.
There's 2 points I wanted to make since you digressed on the email, and I've read it. I won't name any names or get into any specifics, maybe later after this conversation. But you mentioned how art is a prism. I want you to elaborate on that. And on the basis of names, I think that's an interesting thing. I don't really know if it has any kind of real world implication. But Dan, for instance, that has been an ongoing mentor in my life. I've had different iterations of Dan throughout my 28 years. But go on, the art is a prism.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, that's just circumstance. I mean, there are going to be patterns that occur, and it's about noticing them. Some patterns are just, you know, odd little coincidences that are, oh, that's interesting. Others, some people think that there's some deep meaning to it. I don't. Synchronicity is an interesting thing, but I don't think there's anything that much to it. But as far as being a prism, yeah, art is literally that thing which changes it. If you send a light beam without the prism, you wouldn't know that light is composed of all colors. But the prism lets you see that. And in the same way, art focuses. Later we're going to talk about some of the first 2 or 3 plays I've done on historical figures, the great Khans, Genghis Khan and his son Ogadai Khan. And in those plays, there's some, I take some historical facts and I add some characters that weren't real, and I extrapolate upon things that I've known and read over the years to give a portrait of these 2 men. And art allows me to do that, whereas a historian or a scientist that's just looking up Genghis Khan and that he's got 20% of the men in Asia or the people in Asia are descendants of Genghis Khan, and that's interesting, but doesn't say anything more rich, doesn't say anything more deeply that we don't intuitively know. But my plays do. A work of art does. And that's the prism. That's the thing that if you remove it, you're never going to know that. You're never going to get an idea about whatever the topic might be at the center of that artwork without the art. And it's easy to try to compare or say, oh, well, but, you know, everyone's good at something or what. Well, yeah, okay, so you're good at checkers. Big deal. Okay, maybe you win a tournament or whatnot. And yeah, there's probably an international checkers society, just like there is for backgammon and chess. But ultimately, that doesn't do anything. You know, Bobby Fischer, considered the greatest chess champion, the greatest chess player of all time, would nowadays lose to a computer. Now, there's going to come a time, maybe in 100 or 200 years, when there's going to be computers that are artificially intelligent, and they'll create some kinds of art. But unless they're embodied like a human being, they're not going to be able to write a great novel to the same depth. There'll be some technical, they will be sort of like a Mark Van Doren, like I was saying. A great AI could be like a Van Doren, someone who has technical polish, but there isn't going to be the experience behind it that melds it, and that's where you get the synergy and something takes off.
It's interesting about games too, because I was in poker in my younger years, and that's true. So Wild Bill Hickok, whatever strategy he had, is a joke today. Whereas in 100 or 200 years, when there are better writers than any today, you can still derive appreciation from Norwegian or Marley's or an O'Neill play, but you cannot derive the same thing from Wild Bill Hickok. Whatever strategy he may have implemented in playing cards is already a joke and invalidated. The same thing with science.
Yeah.
Science is something that's falsifiable that helps to increase the public's knowledge, but it doesn't really do anything outside of that. And the people who had those initial discoveries are often invalidated. Maybe they had a glimmer of a point, but it usually dissipates.
The pre-Copernican solar system, the idea of the geocentric universe, and then the heliocentric universe replaced that, and now we know that there's no center to the visible universe that we can tell. These things get washed away. Now, it's interesting to associate a certain name with this viewpoint, just like before Darwin, there was Lamarckism, and there were a few other theories of how things evolved. The idea that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, meaning that the fetus goes through all the stages from fish up to human being in utero. These are interesting things, but they have no real scientific basis. But you can come back in 10,000 years. Like I've said many times with my own work, if there's someone flying around the galaxy and it's a non-human that has a translation of all, all human art or literature up to that point, Moby Dick is still going to be relevant, because even though that creature is never going to have sailed upon the Pacific or the Atlantic and has seen a white whale, most likely, they will know that that's just a metaphor for something. Hopefully they'll get that the idea of metaphor and whatnot, and by doing that, they'll be able to see that. But that scientist on that same ship with the creature that appreciates Melville or me or a Rembrandt painting is going to look at the works of Lamarck or even Darwin. Has in some ways his work has been taken off from, and some of his ideas have been shown to be false. Darwin is important. These people are important, but they are steps on a ladder that keeps ascending and ascending. There is no ascension with them. Yes, I can say I'm influenced by Melville, but I'm not the next rung up from Melville. Art moves this way. Art, have you ever seen Star Trek? Remember in the original Star Trek where Spock and Kirk play a multi-level chess game, 3 dimensions?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what art is compared. If you want to talk about chess or checkers as being just in 1 dimension, just this way, that, backward, forward, jump 3 spots. But imagine art as not just being tri-level, but maybe 15, 20 levels or whatnot. And you can go from the board 20, up on the right here to the back, and you can make multiple moves like that. That's what art is. And it is just so far beyond science. By its nature needs to and has to go by baby steps, but because you have to be able to take that Keatsian negative capability, that leap of illogic, and be able to go 5. You have to be able to go from board number 3 with the queen about to take a rook and be able to jump up, to board number 12 or whatnot. You can't do that in science. And
thing about science too is some of the best science, quote unquote, in terms of actually holding up is just the entertainers, the Carl Sagans and Lauren Isleys, the ones that actually use art on different degrees. than actual science. I can derive something out of Cosmos, even though it's using a lot of dated. For instance, today I was just reading about how they think that stars are binary now,
Huh.
whereas what he posited in Cosmos is that a star goes through a life cycle and then becomes a black hole. That's not necessarily how they see the universe. Stephen Hawking, too, was talking about how he didn't think there was an actual event horizon around a black hole, even though he's the one who came up with the idea or was part of the few people who did. Uh, because of this invalidating quality to science, it doesn't hold up to rereading. You don't get the essence of the person and you don't get the essence of the science. But you do get something, even if it's falsifiable, when they present it in a form of entertainment or in art.
To paraphrase, I think it might be William Butler Yeats, science is the old curio shop. It's the curiosity shop. Old science is discarded, and you can pick up, a sextant or something and look at it and say, oh, that's a beautiful instrument. It doesn't serve me now, doesn't serve me, today. We have radar for ships and what. We don't need sextants and whatnot, but it's interesting. Art isn't an old curiosity shop. Art is living and breathing. And again, in 1,000 years, if you go and you open up that first page of a Norwegian in the Family, or the Vincetti Brothers, or one of these plays, or one of my great poems, I'm there. The person who invented the sextant, if there was a single person, is irrelevant. It's a notation. It's trivia. Art by its nature is not trivia. It's essential. It's what makes us human. Yes, science can tell us about the world in the material sense, but science can never answer the why questions. And art, when it's great, does. And just I've said this before to you, I think, is that Melville did not write Moby Dick just to have you ask questions. The answers are there. If you don't get the answers, that's on you, not on Melville.
Did you want to say anything else about Lana's, or can we continue to?
Well, I just want to one thing here, because I'm just gonna read from the ending here. So after Danny is thinking, he's thinking about some of the other plays he wrote. The play ends like this here, and I wanted this is a good example of poetic prose that ends this play. Not only just in the words, but the images that it conveys. If you were someone who's acting this out. So the last stage directions are: Danny drives on in silence for another 20 seconds. First, the lit portion of the car with him in it goes black. Then the whole stage and theater goes dark, save for the high beam headlights. Then the high beams swerve from going straight out into the audience to across the stage left, and they light upon a cute little white blonde girl with curls, no more than 5 years old. It is Lana Abbey. She just giggles, then waves to Danny, or the audience, or all of time and space, and slowly the lights fade until only the giggles of childhood flow over the unseen audience. That's how it ends. Now that, if I broke it up, could be a solid poem. The little blonde girl with the curls, that's referencing, when she's bad, she's very good. When she's bad, when she's hard. The little girl with the curl on the foot, and the whole thing with the high beams spotlighting that. I mean, there's a very cinematic image. How many times have we seen, like, someone is driving in a movie or a TV show, and then boom, they swerve, or the actor moves, and boom, we see something else. So in that just 6 or 7 lines of stage direction, you get references to other things, but it's done so subtly that if you're reading that, you're being caught up in what you're visualizing in your head, but it's so rife with references to other things that I mean, that's great writing right there. That's a great ending, but it's just pure great writing.